How's it going? Today I figured I'd talk about how I've been implementing sound effects in my games recently. Because if you've put sound effects in your own game before, you might know that sometimes you can get some weird issues, or it might be hard to kind of sidestep some certain problems, like two identical sounds playing at the same time so they're too loud, not being able to easily control the volume for all of your sound effects with like a simple variable or something like that, and maybe not knowing good ways to trigger sound effects or make a sound effects loop, stuff like that. So I'm going to show you how I made my sound effects manager. It's super simple. As far as I know, it's a pretty decent system. So I'll do what I normally do first and show you some examples of the system working first, and then we'll get right into it. So yeah, good luck! Okay, so here we're on a little beach that has a bunch of different stuff on it that we can walk around and make noises with. We have some classics, like some coins, and we have other stuff like getting on and off, like switches. And then I have these vents up here, which are like a looped sound effect that loops as long as the fire's going. And the way I have this one set up is a little weird, but basically this one is just a faded in looped sound effect. So whenever you step in the water, it fades in, and there's this nice like ocean air kind of sound to it. And then whenever you step off, it fades away. So you notice at the top left, I have a little red X up there by SFX Manager. And that's because the way the game is working right now is whenever I need a sound effect to play, like so for example the coin, I have what the coin says, if it touches the player, it destroys itself and plays a sound effect. Right now I have it set up to where it just does both of those things right there. The coin handles all of that code. Same with the way the vents and the switches work, but there's kind of an issue with doing it that way. So you see I have some grouped together coins. So this is what coins normally sound like. And this is what it sounds like when I run into these. Hear how loud that got. So you got those normal ones, and then, well, missed it, but yeah, really loud, really loud. Same with these switches too. This is what the switches normally sound like, but if you maybe step on two at a time, it's double the volume. Because whenever two completely identical sounds play at the exact same time, the intensity of their waves are just added together. So it sounds exactly the same, but it literally just gets twice as loud. And this actually isn't super uncommon to see in a lot of, especially indie games and stuff, where instances like that can happen, where, especially like collecting coins or experience or something like that, and you get these random really loud sounds. So I'm going to reset this real quick, and now I'm going to switch over to the SFX Manager that I have in the game. So I'm going to turn that on, and now I'm going to try the same thing. So yeah, we're not getting any more of the bad volume problems. And you'll see here I have sound effect volume. I just have it set up to where if I click this, it just cycles through increments of 10%. But so yeah, 10%, 20, 30, 40. So there you go. I can even show you on the fire here. So yeah, so basically I'm going to show you how to set up like a sound effect manager object, and that'll just kind of solve a few different problems that can arise whenever you're just hard coding sound effects into different effects and objects and stuff like that. And this way we'll be able to use volume. So let's get to it. Okay, so starting off, you'll see that I have a folder that just says everything else, and that's basically just all the stuff that you would already have. Like I have my player object in there and some sprites and stuff like that. So really all I have is a blank room with a background that I drew, and my player object that can just move up, down, left, and right. So for our first and most simple example, let's just start with the coin, because that'll cover about how probably you want most sound effects to work. So I'm going to right click and create a new object. Okay, so I'm going to name this O coin, and for the sprite, I'm going to select the coin sprite that I already have, and just make sure that my collision mask is nice and big so the player can actually run into it. Then add my step event for the actual collision with the player. So yeah, what we want to do is when the player touches this, it's a coin, so we want to get rid of it, and we want to trigger a sound effect. Super easy. So say if place meeting XYO player, then first let's destroy ourselves right there, and then above that we can say play a sound effect and leave some space for that. Now we don't have a sound effect yet, so let's go make one. So close this, go over here, right click, go to create, scroll down to sound. We have our little sound panel for our sound assets. The first thing we actually need to do before we mess with any of this stuff is just actually locate the sound on our computer. And I have my coin sound right here. But it's important to realize that you should know where your sound effects are. You probably shouldn't be pulling your sound effects from your desktop or from your downloads or anything like that that can change. You should put it somewhere where you purposefully have that folder path. So anyways, now you're just going to select open, and we can test it right here. So yeah, it's working. You can also press the loop button so you can test how stuff loops if you have a looping sound effect and make sure it's playing properly. You can change the initial volume of it. Then you have all this stuff down here. Now for sound effects are pretty small, even if they are wave files, which wave files are very lossless, which means that they naturally are a lot bigger than, like, say, MP3s or something like that. But because they're lossless and they can load a little bit faster, you want at least your really tiny sound effects to be wave files, in which case uncompressed, not streamed is totally fine for that. You don't need to worry about this stuff that much. And then you have other things like sample rate, bit rate, quality. If you're making your own sound effects in like a DAW, then you would probably just want to make sure that these match however you exported it. But otherwise, for most things, this is going to be fine, these settings. And then you have output, either mono or stereo. You're probably not going to be messing around with 3D much. But basically, if your sound effect is in stereo, like it has a left and right track to it, then you can change this to stereo. All my sound effects are just in mono, so it doesn't really matter. But just know that if you have a really crazy sounding sound effect and you put it into GameMaker Studio and you play it and it sounds weird, it might be because it's set to mono when it should be set to stereo. And then lastly, we have audio groups, which I've never really messed with too much personally, mostly because I think this method probably skips over needing to use them too much. I have used them before for different things, but with this system, I haven't needed to use them. I think maybe if you have like a big game with tons and tons of sounds and assets and stuff like that, it would probably be good for maybe loading purposes and stuff like that. But for now, you don't need to worry about it. But definitely look into it. You know, read up on it on all of the, Yo-Yo Games has tons of write-ups on all their stuff. They have the big manual online. So yeah. But anyways, we have our sound effect loaded in. I'm going to name it to sound coin, like this. Lowercase SND and then capital sound effect. And yeah, okay. So let's go back to our object coin where we had our place for playing a sound effect. And I'll show you the simple way of adding in a sound effect first because it's slightly easier. So for that, we can use the function audio play sound. And this takes 3 different arguments. First is the sound ID, and that's going to be our sound coin. Then we have priority, which basically means if there's a whole bunch of sound effects playing all at once, how important is this sound effect? I think you can put the range from 1 to 100 or 1 to 10. It doesn't really matter. All it does is it sorts by which number is the highest. I always go 1 to 10, but I tend to really just stick to 2 numbers a lot of times. But I would say sound effects are pretty important. I generally put sound effects at like 8, and I might put music at like 5 or something like that. But anyways, it doesn't really matter. So yeah, just know that I do it 1 to 10, and I normally put sound effects at 8. So that, and then it asks, do we want the sound effect to loop? And we don't. This is a coin we're picking up, so it just needs to play the one time, and that's it. Okay, hello, this is me from the future after I recorded the whole video. Something I want to touch on super quick before we move on, since I know some people are probably going to test something in their game and it might not work out for them this way. This function, audio play sound, if I were to just call it in a step event, then it would start playing that sound every single frame. It would start playing a new version of that sound every frame. The reason it's working out for our coin object here is because the moment we're touching the coin is being destroyed, and we're triggering the sound, and after it's destroyed, obviously it can't trigger the sound anymore. So that's why it works. So if you're testing this on something slightly different, like maybe something with an animation, like this little guy I added here, he like spits up a coin every couple seconds. With a guy like this, what I did was I added a variable called played sound for checking whether or not we have played our sound. And then here's what I did in our step event. Let me make this big again. So if we look at this guy's animation, here it is, really simple one. we see that on this frame here is when we would want to trigger a sound of him spitting. In this case, it's just the coin sound. So subimages always start at 0, so that's 0, 1, 2. So on subimage 2, we want to trigger that sound, right? So back in our step event for this coin spitter guy, basically we're checking if we're on the desired subimage. We're using floor here, which basically means it always rounds down to the nearest whole number. Because an image index can have decimals, that's how the speed works. So we're just going to say anytime we are over, equal to or over to 2, we will be displaying our spitty coin part. And so then we're just going to check if we've played the sound. If we're on this frame and we haven't played the sound, then play the sound and set this variable to true. So we won't play it every single frame, every single in-game frame that this subimage is being displayed. And then I'm just resetting that variable anytime our image index is not displaying that subimage. Just figured I'd mention that now in case you're having an issue where your sound effects are playing 1,000,000 times a second. Later in the video, I do go more in depth about this with other scenarios, and I show some more examples, like showing you how I handle the sound effect triggering. But because I do that later in the video, I figured right now it would be a good place to kind of squeeze this in here. But if you are having some problems, just keep following along with the video, and when I get to that explanation section later on, you might see some examples that more apply to your own stuff. Okay, anyways, back to it. Oh, and before I go, I should just show you it working, shouldn't I? There we go. Perfect. So I'm gonna go back into my room, and then I'm gonna drop in some coins and just test it really quick. Looking good. And we do, in fact, have that issue where it gets louder if you trigger a sound effect twice at once. So again, that's the main issue with just using the sound effects this way. Now you may say to yourself, well, we have functions like instance exists, where we check if an object is around. So do we have a function to check whether or not a sound is already playing, and can we use that to make sure that we don't play overlapping sounds? Yes, there is a function for that. And that function is audio is playing. And then we pass in the sound ID. So we could finish this out and say if not audio is playing, which is what that exclamation point means, and we put in our sound coin here, put our brackets around it. So what this will do is it'll check if there's any instance of this sound effect playing, and we're saying only if this sound is not playing, then we should play the sound effect. That might sound like a good solution, but let's test it out and see what happens. So if I put myself in between these two coins again, okay, that's the same exact volume, so it seems to patch. Oh, but did you see that? One of the coins actually didn't play a sound. And let's see it with these two again. So if I come from the top, you see that? What's happening here is the sound effect lasts for about 7/10 of a second, I think this said. Yeah. So basically that means that once you collect a coin for 7/10 of a second, we can't trigger this sound again with more coins. And maybe you want like a really shiny, sparkly coin sound that lasts for a full second and has like a big trail off. Or maybe you think of a game like Hollow Knight where so many of the sound effects are like drenched in reverb and delay. Well, that's actually probably just the system they have in there. It's probably not the actual sound effect. But, the point is, if you want to make a sound effect that has tons of decay on it, then this is not a viable solution. Because then you're going to have pickups and coins and enemies attacking and stuff, and they're not triggering sound effects. So how do we solve this problem? And how do we solve the problem of doubling up sound effects by accident? Well, that's when we make our sound effect manager. So let's make a new object. So create object. And I'm going to call it lowercase o and then capital SFX. Just object sound effects. Now pay attention, this is important. This needs to be a persistent object. This object is going to hang out for the entire game and play our sound effects for us. So how are we going to do that? Well, first I'm going to add a create event here to create some variables that'll help us out. And I'm going to make a variable called coin sound, like this. And I'm going to set it equal to false. We're going to use other objects to constantly be setting this variable to true or false, and that's how this object is going to know to play a sound. So let me show you what I mean. Now we can add a step event, and what I like to do with this object is instead of just a normal step event, I'm going to add the end step event, because this object is going to have to receive information from other objects in order to play those sound effects. So if I put it at the end step, since I would assume most other objects in our game are going to be handling all of their step-by-step code in either the begin step or the normal step event, that means on the same exact frame that we give this object a command to play a sound effect, that it will play it. So we're going in our end step. I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going to say coin sound. So here we can check our coin sound variable. So if coin sound is equal to true, then first what we can do is we can play that sound effect. So audio play sound, sound, coin, priority 8, doesn't loop, same as we did before, and we'll say that's play sound, and then we can reset our variable back to false. So coin sound equals false. So if 1 or 100 objects tell object sound effect to play sound coin on the same frame by setting its coin sound to true, it'll only play it once, because all it's checking for is whether or not the variable's true. If it's been set 1,000 times on the same frame, it doesn't matter. It's still true, just like if it was set once. So for a single frame, it can play this. It immediately sets itself back to false. So the next frame, it's already ready to be able to play it again. And we're solving that issue of doubling up on sounds. So we can send the command to OSFX. Right up here where we were trying to play the sound effect, we can, instead of doing this, we can just say OSFX dot coin sound equals true. So when we touch the player, it'll set coin sound to true just for that single frame, because we're being destroyed after that. And then our OSFX object will play the sound. Now before we test this, we need to remember to actually put OSFX in the game. So I'm going to go to my room, and for now I'm just going to put my sound effect object just out here. It doesn't matter. I've gone over this in a couple other videos, but whenever you have these persistent objects that manage things for your entire game, you want to put them in some kind of starter room or a title screen or something like that, where the player can never come back and accidentally make duplicates of this same object. I generally make like an initialization room that runs first before anything else in the game. I put all the important stuff in it and the persistent stuff, and then I immediately tell the game to hop to the next room in some object or like the room creation code. So that out of the way, now we should be ready to test it, and let's give it a go. And actually, just to make this testing a little bit easier, I'm gonna add some more coins that are all just right on top of each other right here, so we can really test the sound effect volume. Well, they look a little goofy because I didn't set their depth, but that doesn't matter. So let's test. Same exact volume. And we're not having that issue where we are missing any sound effects. Looky there. So before we move on to any other types of sound effects, let's add something else. So because we're going to be controlling everything from right here, it's going to be really easy to be able to manually set the volume of any of these sounds. So that way we can add in an option for the player to change the sound effect volume or anything like that. And it also gives us the benefit of being able to tweak all the sound effects volume at once. So let's say get the volume. So let's just start this out with a local variable, and I'm going to call this var sfx vol. And we'll just set it to 1 for now, for 100%, because before adding any kind of variable stuff to that, let's talk about how volume or gain works with sound effects like this. So there's a function that is very easy to forget the name of, which I believe is audio sound gain. It's not audio gain, and it's not audio set gain. It's audio sound gain, and it can be very easy to forget that. I forget it all the time. But what this does is it means that we can change the gain level of a certain sound effect, right? It has 3 arguments. So for example, let's say if we said sound coin, and then we added a level, which would be from 0 to 1, just like how our editor works here, where 1 is 100% and 0 is 0%. So let's just say 0.5 for now for half volume. And then time, which is interesting because time actually functions in terms of milliseconds, not game frames or anything like that. So this just tells us how quickly we need to set sound coins gain to 0.5, which would be 50%. So if we said 1,000, it would take half a second to bring it from 1, which it is currently set at in our editor, to 0.5. Now, if you use this function, and if I were to call this function exactly how it is, it would basically be setting the assets sound coin and any instances of this sound coin playing. It would set all of them to 50% over the course of 1 second. And that could also mean, say for our coin object, we wanted to play sound coin at full volume, and we wanted it to play immediately, so we would set the time to 0, which means it would immediately set it to 1. But then, say maybe somewhere else in the game, we wanted a completely different type of object to use the coin sound for some other reason, for a completely different purpose. And for that one, we wanted it to play really quietly for some reason, so a quarter volume. So then from this point on, anytime audio play sound coin would be called outside of this little function here, its gain would actually be at that 25% there. It wouldn't be at its default 1 like in our editor. So there's a few issues with just calling audio sound gain just straight up on a sound asset. So yeah, knowing how audio sound gain works, we can actually store an instance of a sound playing in a variable or a local variable. So I'm gonna make a local variable called var_sound, like that, and set that equal to audio play sound, because this function does return essentially an instance of sound coin playing. And now that we have the ID of that, basically, we can manipulate that how we want to. So instead of manipulating sound coin, we will just manipulate this single instance of it playing. And so we're playing a sound effect, we're storing its ID basically, and then we're gonna set the gain of that specific sound effect, and we can set it to our SFX volume. So let me just show you that real quick. Okay, so our coins are playing at the same volume they were before, and if I exit out of here and we change this to, let's say, 0.3, so it should be 30% of the volume that it was before. And it is. It's a lot quieter. Great. So now we can set up some variables for controlling the volume, and we're not going to mess with this much. I'll just show you how to do it. You can set these wherever you want to, but let's make some global variables. First, I'm just going to make a global variable for our sound effect volume. So I'm going to say SFX_volume like that, and I'll set that to 1, and we can put that here, global.sfxvolume. So now we can just change it here, and that means we could also put this in like a menu somewhere and have the player be able to add, 0.1 or 0.2 with a right and left click or something like that. That's what I did in that little demo, is I just had it to where if I clicked the left mouse button, it added 10%, and then once it got over 100%, it went down to 0. So now we and the player should be able to control sound effect volume as long as we do every sound effect like this. And for example, another thing we could even do is we could also have like global dot master volume, and I'll just set that to 1 again. But we could just multiply our sound effect volume times the master volume, and this will give us the same result. So that way we can keep sound effect volume, and maybe like vocal sound effects or vocal lines could be different, a different volume setting, and music could be a different volume setting, which is how the games normally do it, and then have a master setting for all three if you wanted to. Which, I mean, at that point, you could just set the sound effect, voice, and music volume all to be the same number anyways, if that's how you wanted to do it, but, just a simple way to do it, and it's a simple option. One last thing to remember with this type of sound effect, we have to remember that we need to set it in the same way that we would just play a sound effect. So the reason this code works is because we're destroying the coin, right? On the same frame we're setting the sound effect to be true. If for whatever reason, maybe this was an object you stand on, for example, like the switches that I showed in the opening, you can't just set this to true. You have to maybe have some other kind of variable or have a state switching that goes with it. So for example, if I touch a coin now, because the coin won't go away, it'll play that sound effect every single frame. So yeah. So just to show you a quick example of that, here I've added 2 more sound effects. I did it the exact same way as I did with the coin. I added in my sound effects, so sound button press and sound button release. Added them the exact same way. Went back into my sound effect manager, my OSFX, and added some variables for them, so button press sound and button release sound. Did it the same way, made sure I filled everything in right. And then here we have my button object. So the sprite for this button is very simple. It's just up and it's down, and the image speed is set to 0. That's all it is. And in the step event, I basically only trigger the sound effect whenever these conditions are right. So if the image index is 0, which means it's in the up position, and the player is touching it, then we will set it to the down position and then play the sound effect. And now that our image index is 1 in the down position, then we're not going to play it every single frame. And that's for the press sound, and then I did the opposite for the release sound, which is if my image index is 1, which means it's in the depressed position, and the player is not on top of it, then set the image index back to 0 so it pops back up, and then play the release sound. And that looks and sounds like this. Very simple. And because we're doing the system this way, if I press both at once, it doesn't alter the volume at all. So that's it for single triggered sound effects like that. So now what if we have a sound effect that we want to loop for some reason, like my fire vents? Well, first you need to load in your sound effect. So I've made a new sound called Sound Fire, and I'm going to do the preview loop and check. Yeah, so it's looping fine. If it's not looping fine, then you may have exported something weird in whatever program it is you do, like music or sound effects in or something. Or the sound effect you downloaded might not loop perfectly. But generally, WAV files loop really, really well, as long as you plan it out properly. MP3 files really don't loop very easily at all. And so if you're trying to use MP3 files for sound effects, don't do that. Use waves. But yeah, so I'm just going to assume we have a working looping sound effect for you. So let's go back into our sound effect manager and add some new variables for this fire sound effect. So I'm going to call this fire sound, and then I'm going to call it loop. We'll say that equals false. And now, like I said, we're going to have to do this one slightly differently, because we can't just play this one and let it just go wild like the other ones did. We need to keep track of this one, so instead of storing this in the local variable of sound like we did with other ones, we're going to give it its own variable out here first. So I'm going to call this fire sound loop, and then inst for the instance of that. And we can set this to false or 0 or whatever, or I'm just going to set it to no one. This is just generally what I do whenever I have like a variable that I want to store an ID of something in, or an instance of something. It's just another value in GameMaker that basically just means it, false. They don't have the same literal value, but yeah, anyway, it's not important to get into that right now. Just know that it's a good way to identify if something exists or not. Like if I used that function is audio playing, and I checked with this, if it was equal to no one, then it would say, no, it's not playing. So yeah, anyways, to the step event. So let's make a little group, and I'm just going to call this looping SFX, and I'm going to tab out just so I know this is under that same umbrella. And let's call this fire. So the way I'm going to do this is the opposite of how we did these kind of. Like I said, if you have an object that is constantly setting this to true, like I did with the coins when the coins didn't destroy, and it played the sound every single frame, you didn't want to do that for these single burst sound effects, right? But what I want to do down here is I want an object to be able to keep streaming that information. We don't want the sound effect to play every single frame, but for example, with that little vent object that I made, it was basically saying if my sprite is the fire vent sprite that is spewing flames, then it would constantly be setting the fire sound effect to true, and anytime there are no objects setting it to true, that's when it cuts off. So that's why we need to do this a little bit differently. So first, let's just check if it's being set to true. So if fire sound loop is equal to true, and not just that, but we want to make sure that this sound instance is not playing. So that's what this variable is mostly for. So we'll say and not audio is playing fire sound loop inst. So now we can play the sound in basically the same way we did on this line. So we can say fire sound loop inst equals audio play sound, and I want to do my sound fire. Because this is a looping sound effect, We could maybe drop the priority a little bit. And we do want this one to loop, obviously. So if this is being set to true, and we don't have an instance of this sound playing, then we create an instance of that sound playing, and this will stop us from creating a sound effect every single frame that this is set to true. So we're good there. But we don't want to manually set this back to false like we did with these yet. And we also don't want to set the volume of the sound effect down here yet, since most of these looping sound effects can play for an indeterminate amount of time. We don't want to set the volume the moment it starts, because maybe we play a sound effect that loops for a really long time and then the player changes the sound effect volume, and so we want this to be able to change volume in real time. But before we do any of that, we also need a way to turn this sound effect off. And to do that, we just have to do the exact opposite. So I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going to say turn sound effect on and store the instance of the sound. And here I'm going to go for turn sound effect off. And we basically just have to do the exact opposite thing. So we need to see if the fire sound loop is equal to false, and our audio is playing of fire sound loop instance, then we need to terminate that sound with audio stop sound fire sound loop instance. Pretty self-explanatory function. It just stops the sound. And similarly to audio sound gain, if we used audio stop sound on our actual sound asset and not an instance like this, then even if other objects that were completely unrelated were playing this sound effect for a completely different reason at the same time, it would cut all those out as well. So this way we're just stopping the vent fire, or whatever is using this specific fire loop. So good, so now it can turn on and off. And we know that we want other objects to be able to set fire sound loop to true, like the vent, but where do we set it to false if we're not going to do it like we did up here right whenever we play the sound in the first place? Easy. We just do it at the very end. We say fire sound loop equals false. We do it after we check all of this stuff. If we set this to false after we're using it up here, it basically means from this point on, which is the end step event, any object that sets fire sound loop to true, whether it's after this, like the very, very end step event, or if it's in a begin step or regular step, anywhere else, it doesn't matter where another object will set it or what event it sets it in. If an object somewhere is saying that fire sound loop needs to be true, then it will be true over here. For example, the fire vent in its normal step event says, as long as my sprite is the fire sprite, set this sound effect to true. We get to the end step events. We get here, it says it's true, it starts playing the sound. It's checking to turn it off right here, where right here the sound effect is still true, and then we get down to fire sound loop setting it to false. But as long as that fire vent is still setting this to true, it doesn't matter because we're going back around. We start the next frame of the game, and by the time we get back over here, anything is still saying this is true. So hopefully that wasn't too much of a word salad, but if it was, just trust me, this works, and it makes sense. So yeah, it should be stopping and starting fine now. And let me just pull out that vent object, and I'll kind of show you what it's doing. So first thing is, I duplicated the object button and made a blue button, made a blue sprite for it. You can see it's exactly the same. It's just a separate object, so that way I can have the fire vents reference just a single blue button. So anyways, here that is, really simple. In the create event, it just has a state variable. 0 means that it's off, and 1 means that it's on with the fire coming out. And in the step event, I basically check if a blue button exists. If it does, then I want to set the state to be the image index of the blue button, which means if the blue button is up, then we're turned off, so the state is 0. And if the blue button is image index 1, which means it's pressed down, then that means we're on. And we're just saying, if our state is equal to 0, which means we're off, then I set the sprite to fire vent off. And if our state is 1, which means it's on, we set it to fire vent on, which is this one. And we set the fire sound effect loop to be true. And then this is just so they draw in the right depth. So that this is unimportant. So yeah, very simple, just for testing purposes, but let's start putting some of this stuff in the room so we can test it. So I'm just gonna put a bunch of vents around like this. and then a blue button right here. So let's try that out. And it seems to be working. Okay. And notice we have at least like 12 or whatever vents out, and the sound effect is only as loud as it's supposed to be. It's not playing 12 times in a row, because otherwise we would all be deaf. So cool. Now, we haven't added in the volume functionality. So for example, if I were to put our sound effect volume to like 10%, so 0.1, and I were to hit play, obviously all these would be way quieter, but the fire would be the same. And we don't really want that, so let's just keep it at 10% for now, so we can test it in a second. So let's do what we were talking about a minute ago and set our gain as the sound effect is actually playing. So let's say set the volume. Let's say if audio is playing our fire sound loop instance, then we just simply set it right here in the same way that we did with the other ones. But at this point, we're checking the entire time if the audio is playing. Remember, we need to check this instance again, set it to the SFX volume, and set it to 0 so it is just constantly matched up with whatever the volume is. Now, technically, you probably wouldn't want to just do this with looping sound effects. You would probably want to do this with longer sound effects too, so maybe you had a sound effect that lasted for 4 or 5 seconds and had a really long decay to it or something like that. Anything that lasts a while, you probably want to set it every frame, like I'm doing with this looping one, and will do with all the other looping ones. And technically you could do it with every sound effect if you wanted to, and you would get the same result. But I figure with these really short ones, like these button press sounds and the coin sounds, they're so short, the player's not really going to have a chance to run into a coin, open up a menu, change the sound effect volume, and even notice that the sound effect volume doesn't go down right away. So that's why I just set these on the same frame as playing the sound, because then we're not checking for anything constantly. We're not checking if the sound is playing. You know, that would require all of these other sound effects to have their own like sound instance like this, like the fire sound loop instance. So yeah, like I said, even if you're doing sound effects like this, maybe if you have one that's really long, like 5 to 10 seconds, and it just goes on for a while, then you might want to set it up in a similar way to this, where instead of using this local variable of _sound, you would just make so like coin sound inst and set that to no one over here, and you know, do it the same way as we did down here. I don't think it's that big of a deal. I think it's a lot more reasonable to just do it for like looping sound effects and, you know, long ambient stuff and things like that. So anyways, I had one more style that I showed off in the demo, and that was whenever you walked into the water, it started, it faded in a looping sound effect, and whenever you got off the water, it would fade it out. So we can cover that one really quickly. I might just squeeze all this together a little bit more just so we know it's all the same sound effect. Okay, so here's another loop I have. This is the beach loop, where it's just like a wave crashing, then going down, then another one kind of crashing. That one's not perfect, but it's all right, especially for demonstration purposes. So as you could tell in that loop, it's always at full volume. It doesn't fade in and it doesn't fade out. It has a harsh beginning and a harsh end. It obviously gets a little bit quieter because that's just kind of, you know, the sound of it, but it would be noticeable if I just dropped in that sound effect in the same way that I did with the fire sound, right? So we want that one to kind of ease in and ease out. Like you can imagine maybe you had like a sci-fi kind of sound effect, and there were like these glowing panels you could stand on, and if you stand on it, it lights up slowly and the sound kind of comes in, and then whenever you step off of it, it starts to fade back out. A beach would probably be better for a more proximity thing, but anyways, this is just what I did, all right? So let's say beach. We're gonna start this the same way as the fire, so we need beach sound loop. We need to store the instance in the same way, so beach sound loop instance. And we want two more things. We want beach sound loop vol for volume, and we'll start that at 0. Since these sound effects are fading in, so initially we want it to be 0. And then we need to set the speed that we want the fade in and out. So I'm going to say beach sound loop volume speed equals something. Put 1 for now. but I'm explaining in a second. First, I'm just going to say, feel free to name your variables however you want. If you think I get pretty wordy, then you don't have to name things like me. Just make sure you're naming variables that make sense to you and that you can remember. That's more important than anything else. But yeah, so basically we're going to be adding this speed to the volume or subtracting it whenever we need to. And 1 is obviously going to be 100% volume, and 0 is going to be no volume. So if we're thinking about this in terms of game frames, my game runs at 60 frames a second. Yours probably does too. So if I wanted the fade to take place over, let's say 3 seconds, we would want to divide 100% by the amount of game frames it would take to get to 3 seconds, right? Let's say we just wanted it to be 2 frames, which would be imperceptibly fast, but it would basically be the same thing as just setting it to 1 immediately. But anyway, so let's say if we wanted it to be 2 frames, we would set it to 1 divided by 2, right? Because that would be 0.5. And if we were adding 0.5 every frame, that means it would take 2 frames to get volume from 0 to 1, right? So same if we divided by 10, that means it would take 10 frames, and so on. So if you just want to think about it in terms of seconds, you can open up some parentheses there. And so if our game runs at 60 frames a second, we'll say 60 times 3. So that would be 3 seconds, because that would be 180. 180 frames in our game is 3 seconds, so 1 divided by 180 would mean it would take us 3 seconds to get from 0 to 1, or from 1 to 0 if we were subtracting. Easy peasy, but do this however you want to do. I just generally like doing things this way where I know exactly how long seconds-wise something will take. So, anyways, now we can go back into our end step event, and this is going to be kind of familiar with the fire sound effect, but a little bit different. So we'll call this start the loop and turn up the heat. No, turn up the volume. So we'll say if beach sound loop is equal to true, then we want to run some code in here. We need to do the same kind of check as this, check if the audio isn't playing yet, but we want to do that inside here because we also want to do something else in here, and that's changing the volume. So first, let's just finish off this part of the equation. So let's say play the sound. So if not audio is playing, and we're checking for our beach sound loop instance, just like we did with the fire up here. So beach sound loop instance. Then we will set the beach sound loop instance to audio play sound, sound beach, priority 6 for looping stuff, and true, we needed to loop. So that part's done. But now we're setting our own volume variable. So raise the volume. And we basically just want to say if the volume is not fully at 100%, then we just need to add to it, right? So if beach sound loop volume is less than 1, then we need to add to it. So beach sound loop volume plus beach sound loop volume speed. Oh, sorry, plus equals, not plus. We need to add to it, not just add 2 numbers for no reason. Okay, yeah, so beach sound loop volume plus equals beach sound loop volume speed. And even though we should be fine, we want to make sure that this doesn't go above 1, right? So we can add like an else. So if it's not less than 1, which means it's greater than or equal to 1, then we can just hard set it to 1, like this. So if it's less than 1, we add our speed to it, which means it should take 3 seconds for it to get all the way up to 1. And then we're just making sure that we are keeping its maximum at 1. We don't want the sound effect to get too loud. And I'll show you a little thing I like to do with lines like this. I actually like to put them all on one single line, which you can do. So I'm gonna just do it like this. This is a bit more pleasing to me, and it saves space. But you do you, okay? So anyways, now we're doing the same thing we did with the fire, except when it's set to true, we are raising the volume back up. So now we need to worry about turning it off, and that's also going to be slightly different. So let's say fade out and turn off. So if a beach sound loop is not true and nothing is telling us to play this sound, then instead of like the fire and just turning it off instantly, we need to lower the volume first. So lower the volume, and we just need to do the opposite of this, right? So if our beach sound loop volume is greater than 0, then we're gonna subtract our volume speed. So beach sound loop volume minus equals the beach sound loop volume speed. And the else doesn't really matter, but I'm gonna do it anyways. So beach sound loop volume equals 0. So that way it can't be any less than 0. This one really doesn't matter, but I just like them being parallel like this. So anyways, yeah, so if it's above 0, then we subtract the speed and clamp it back down to 0 basically. And now we want to stop the sound if the gain is 0. So we just need to check if beach sound loop volume is less than or equal to 0. Actually, yeah, I'm going to do this one like this, yeah. So if it's less than or equal to 0, then we can just stop the sound now. So we can audio stop sound beach sound loop instance. So if this is set to false, which means nothing is telling us to play this sound anymore, instead of just cutting it off abruptly, we have to lower the volume down and then stop the instance. But we've only manipulated our own variables, so now we need to actually add in setting the volume, and we can do that very similarly to how we did with the fire, but we just need to compensate for our beach sound loop volume variable as well. So let's say set the volume, if audio is playing beach sound loop instance, then we will do audio sound gain. We'll set the instance of our beach loop. We'll set it to our beach sound loop volume, but we also need to make sure that we're setting it to the like settings volume up here at the top, right? And just the same way that we just have to multiply these together, since they're always going just from 0 to 1, we can do the same thing. So if we use this and we multiply it times our SFX volume, then we will get the exact desired effect that we need, and we need to set it instantaneously as well, since this variable is controlling the fading in and fading out. And the reason we can't use audio sound gains, fade in and fade out, is it wouldn't work with our global sound effect volume, our sound effect setting like this, and it just works better in the system that we have already. And I'm sure you noticed that we only have this one speed variable here, but if you wanted the fade in to be a different speed than the fade out, then you could just have like beach sound loop volume speed out and speed in, and just make them different, and make sure you plug them in to the correct place, right? Like when fading in, you would want to add speed in, and fading out, you would want to subtract speed out, obviously. So now for the final bit is we have to do what we did with fire here, and we have to set the sound loop variable, the beach sound loop variable, back to false. So that way it's just automatically turning itself off when no one is asking the sound effect to be played. So reset variable, beach sound loop equals false. And our beach sound should be working now. I'm going to zoom this out slightly just to see if, okay. So our beach sound should be working, and I'll show you how I actually implemented it into like an object. And here it is, my beach sound block. And literally all it does is just if the player is touching one of these blocks, then it just sets the sound loop to true. Easy peasy. And I turned off visibility so you wouldn't see these ugly icons. I'll show you what it looks like, because now I'm going to add them back in. Obviously for an actual game you'd want to be more careful about this, but yeah, I have this as a 9-slice sprite so it can tile like this. But yeah, so I'll just put some about where, where the water is. I'm not going to worry about it too much, but yeah, so whenever I run the game, these should be invisible, and touching them should make the beach sound effect work. Let's see how it goes. Oh, that's right. The sound effect volume is turned pretty low. I need to change that back. And I don't think we even tested the fire vents. But yeah, they're working. Okay, anyways, let me go back into this and change this to 1 first. And then we can test it at lower volumes as well. Okay, yeah, now everything's back to normal. So, okay, let's see. Okay, nice fade in. We didn't have like a big just cut in that was really jarring. It's looping fine. And what happens if we walk away? Yeah, and it has a nice little fade out. Easy. And the good thing about the way we set it up is it won't really get confused if we walk back on and back out while it's fading in and out. So yeah, and of course there's tons of other ways to implement sound effects You know, there could be like proximity based ones and stuff like that. Hopefully showing you these different methods of how to implement sound effects will kind of put you on the right path if you want to do any stuff like that. I'm gonna squeeze all these in together just to make them all look like they're part of the same place. And just one last little test, making sure that the master volume works, which it does. The beach loop is way quieter, which is nice. Another thing I failed to mention is with this system, you can set your sound effect volumes to whatever you want in this editor out here, and it will persist with this system. It'll be totally fine. So have at it. Well, yeah, that's that. I hope it helped you out. If it did help you out, you can help me out a little bit. Maybe with one of those little likes, little subscription down there. And whoa, wait just a second. What are those pretty little names in the corner? Well, if you have to know, and you couldn't read the top words, those are my Patreon supporters. And a special shout out to my star gamer, Nixionic, or Nix Ionic. Let me know if I'm pronouncing that right. But yeah, super special thanks to all of them. I just started my Patreon. As I stay pretty busy, sometimes it can be hard for me to find time to make more videos, but I really want to make more videos. And so if you also want to help out with that, then maybe head on over there and check it out and look at the different tiers and stuff. The more support I can get on Patreon, the more time I'm going to be able to put towards these videos, which, like I said, I really want to make. So yeah, feel free to check that out. And also, thank you. You're wonderful for watching the video all the way to the end and sticking with it. So yeah, that's about it. I got a game coming out soon, and I'm working on another game. If you're curious about any of that, then you can check out my most recent channel update, or you could also follow me on Twitter, all that stuff. You know all these things. If you care, you can find these places. But yeah, anyways, good luck with the sound effect system, and have a nice day. All right? All right.